Throughout the history of the anime/manga industry, there have been several people who are just literal criminals. Even though these people were blessed with the ability to create or aid in the creation of some of the biggest and inspirational manga and anime in history, this didn't mean that they weren't capable of committing crimes. In 2016, Mamare Touno, who is the author of popular series Log Horizon, was convicted for committing tax evasion on over 120 million yen worth of royalties, which around that time was around $1 million US. This meant that Touno owed the Japanese government over $250,000 in taxes, but he maintained that his not paying these taxes was accidental. Regardless, the court didn't believe that and sentenced him to 3 years of probation. Because of this, Touno received some backlash, with some people calling his actions irresponsible. However, in the end, most people didn't actually care, as Touno ended up paying the taxes and he continued to make Log Horizon and the series maintained its popularity. However, with other people, their crimes were definitely not so forgivable. On January 22, 2018, a manga named Actage was serialized, quickly becoming very popular. In a little over 2 years of publication, Actage had over 3 million copies of its manga in circulation, had a planned stage play adaptation, and had been nominated for various awards such as Kodansha's Shonen Manga of the Year. But why did Actage manage to become so popular? Because Actage was just different. Shonen manga around that time tended to revolve around genres such as action, sports, or fantasy, with some of the biggest publications at the time being My Hero Academia or One Piece. However, with Actage, the author Tatsuya Matsuki made Actage's premise be about acting in the entertainment industry, delving into the psychological and emotional complexities of acting. And while this premise could very easily fall into cheesy scenes and over-the-top cliches, Actage was able to portray its various scenes in a way that was fluid and even emotionally relatable to many readers. On top of this, because of the skill of Actage's artist Shiro Uzuzaki, the illustrations helped to enhance or even portray the story in a very eye-catching and impactful way. And as Actage continued on, both critics and audiences raved with people saying that Actage could be the next big series. However, this all changed in the summer of 2020.
Where he was found to be committing sexual crimes and public sexual harassment to minors.
In August 2020, Actage as a series was cancelled. The manga was no longer published, all merch production was stopped, and even the upcoming stage play was thrown out. And this was because of the horrid actions of the author Tatsuya Matsuki. On June 18, 2020, Japanese news network NHK had reported that an unknown man had been seen sexually harassing 2 middle school age girls. According to the report, the man had snuck up on the girls, and once he had assaulted them, would use his bike to flee as fast as possible. Also, this man not only did this once, but actually came back to the same place an hour later to do it again. However, thankfully, when this crime was reported to the police, they were able to use nearby camera footage to figure out the identity of the perpetrator, and it turned out to be none other than Actage's Tatsuya Matsuki. On August 8, 2020, Tokyo police arrested Matsuki, and he was later formally indicted and even pleaded guilty to his crimes. And the news of his arrest and guilty conviction mortified many Actage readers, causing many people to look at the series in a new light. For example, in one of the pages of the manga, Matsuki had a small commentary box where he talked about potentially getting a bike to meet his quote hobby needs. When this comment was initially made, it seemed harmless, but with the context of Matsuki's crimes, the realization of what these hobbies were and that he was basically talking about committing his future crimes horrified readers. On top of this, even Actage's story itself made some readers uncomfortable, as some plot points, such as the main heroine being a young teenage girl that was being trained and almost raised by an older male character, seem a bit weird with the context of Matsuki's crimes. And because of things like this and the extreme controversy of Matsuki's crimes, Actage was cancelled, but somehow his punishment in court was pretty lenient. During the trial, the prosecution was aiming for at least a jail sentence of 1.5 years with no probation. However, Matsuki's defense argued that he should receive only 3 years probation because he had already been socially punished due to his manga's cancellation. And somehow, this defense worked. For harming the lives of 2 teenage girls, ruining the livelihood of many people associated with the manga, and disappointing hundreds of thousands of fans, somehow Matsuki served no jail time. This decision obviously led to controversy, as many fans saw this as too lenient of a punishment and led to people criticizing the Japanese court system and Matsuki even more. However, while Matsuki's crimes were horrid, at the very least Matsuki immediately confessed to his crimes. However, there was a person in the manga industry that wouldn't even do that. In the early 2010s, Kodansha, a Japanese manga publisher, published various manga series such as Attack on Titan and 7 Deadly Sins. These series became very successful, with Attack on Titan specifically becoming one of the biggest series of all time and Kodansha's best-selling manga. However, with the success of these series, there also came big controversy, and this came in the form of a man named Park Jung-hyun. In January 2017, Park was arrested on suspicion of murdering his wife. Now this incident by itself was already very sensationalized, but what made it even more controversial was Park's association to the manga industry. Before Park's arrest, he had been mainly known as one of the founding members of Kodansha publication Bisatsu Shonen magazine, which was home to AOT, and he had also been one of the main editors for the 7 Deadly Sins manga. Because of the popularity of these two series, Park's arrest sent shockwaves throughout the industry and various fandoms. However, because of how haphazardly and almost ridiculously Park attempted to maintain his innocence, more fuel was added to the fire. On the day of the incident, Park had called emergency services reporting that his wife had collapsed in their home. When officers responded to the emergency call, they found Park's wife Kanako lying face down at the base of the home's stairs. During initial questioning, Park had stated that his wife had just fallen down the stairs. However, later in the trial, when an autopsy revealed that the cause of death was actually due to suffocation by applied pressure on the neck, Park changed his story. Park stated that Kanako had gone crazy and had attacked him with a knife. When Park went to hide with his children, he said that Kanako had ended up hanging herself on the stair railings. However, the prosecution maintained that this was false and accused Park of choking out Kanako on a mattress and later throwing her down the stairs to stage the incident. The prosecution believed this to be true because Kanako had been found with a forehead wound and trace amounts of urine were found on the mattress. This kind of back and forth continued on, whereas new evidence surfaced, Park would always have new stories in order to attempt to explain himself. However, various factors including Park's story not adding up and there being sufficient evidence against Park convinced the judges to convict him of murder and sentence him to 11 years in prison. However, the circus definitely wasn't over as Park continued to maintain his innocence and appealed the court's decision, eventually getting a retrial, but this time in the Japanese Supreme Court. However, the result was no different as the Japanese Supreme Court still found him guilty and on July 18, 2024, reaffirmed his 11-year punishment. To this day, Park still maintains that he is innocent and has even said that he plans to appeal the punishment again. Park, if anything, is determined. However, there is someone else who also committed a heinous crime, but in their case, they had no need to appeal a court's decision, and that's because they didn't even receive a big punishment. In the mid-90s, Rurouni Kenshin was one of the biggest shonen series of its time. With its unique samurai era setting, mature tone, and extremely memorable characters, Kenshin became a hit series. Rurouni Kenshin was so successful that it sold over 72 million copies, had a long-running anime and multiple OVAs, and had multiple live-action films that were actually financially successful. On top of this, Kenshin had stage play adaptations, a ridiculous amount of merchandise, multiple awards, and was one of the few early anime series that even managed to gain some popularity in the West. Because of Kenshin's success, the creator of Kenshin, Nobuhiro Watsuki, also became very popular and well respected in the manga industry. Watsuki's influence was so big that the creators of various huge series such as Shaman King, Naruto, and One Piece directly cited him as one of their major influences in the creation of their own series. However, unfortunately, Watsuki would find himself in a huge controversy. In 2017, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police were conducting an investigation into illegal distribution and possession of CP in Japan. During this investigation, they received leads that Watsuki might be in possession of CP and raided his office, finding several DVDs containing videos of underage girls. As a result, on November 21, 2017, Watsuki was arrested and formally charged for possession. Watsuki during these proceedings had little to no resistance, and when interrogated by police, he openly stated that, quote, he liked girls in the upper grades of elementary school. Understandably, many of his fans and readers of his series were horrified and disgusted by his actions. However, the situation only became more controversial because when Watsuki received the sentence from the court, it was seen as barely even a punishment. Under Japanese law, possession of CP can lead to up to 1 year of imprisonment and a fine of up to 1 million yen. However, when the court handed down Watsuki's sentence, he not only received a smaller fine of 200,000 yen, which was equivalent to around 2,000 USD, but he received absolutely no jail time. On top of this, the current manga that Watsuki was working on, which was a sequel to Rurouni Kenshin, was not even cancelled, but was just put on a hiatus for 6 months. After this hiatus was over, Watsuki was allowed to continue publishing his work, and the only real change the manga faced was that the official English translation of the manga was discontinued. And to this day, Watsuki still actively publishes the manga. This approach and given punishment to Watsuki's crimes became extremely polarizing as some fans, mostly Western fans, refused to support any of Watsuki's works as they saw his actions as abhorrent and his punishment as being not enough. while other fans, mostly Japanese fans, were more willing to separate the art from the artist and continue to consume his series. This difference came down to multiple factors such as cultural difference in perception and response towards CP, and differences in the idea of separating art from artist. This is why to this day, the Rurouni Kenshin series continues to get good sales in Japan, with the series even receiving an anime reboot in 2023, and Shonen Jump even having a big celebratory 30-year anniversary exhibit for Rurouni Kenshin. And while it could be argued whether or not what Watsuki did was the worst crime in the manga industry, the amount of success and fame he has makes him one of the biggest criminals in the manga/anime industry.